All right, so here's our second lecture for adolescent psychology. Our last lecture ended with a slide um, that talked about the fundamental changes of adolescence. Um, Specifically, it talked about the biological transitions, cognitive transitions, and the social transitions. And virtually without exception, no matter where you are in the world, people, adolescents, are going through these biological, cognitive, and social transitions. So, puberty is part of adolescence, no matter where you are. Um, Cognitive, these processes about how people think and them able to think about hypothetical situations, for example, in adolescence. That is universal. These are cognitive abilities that you're going to see in adolescence virtually, without exception, all over the world. And these social transitions, like rites of passage, there's some sort of rites of passage that's part of culture throughout the world in some way, shape, or form. Okay, virtually without exception. So um, that first way, that fundamental changes in adolescence, that biological, cognitive, and social, those social pieces are all one way to kind of wrap your head around adolescence. But there's other pieces of the puzzle that we're going to be talking about this semester in adolescent development. And the second point is the context of adolescence. So we have the fundamental changes, but under what context do they fall? So we have families, we have peer groups, schools, work, leisure, mass media. And then we also have psychosocial development in adolescence: identity, autonomy, intimacy, sexuality, achievement, psychosocial problems. All of these pieces are areas that we're going to touch on this semester as we get to know the adolescent experience. So, although all adolescents experience the biological, cognitive, and social transitions, those fundamental pieces we talked about, those things that without exception are happening no matter where you live in the world, the effects of these changes are not uniform for all people. Okay, so even though everyone's going through puberty pretty much in the same way physically, the effects of what that looks like on the young person varies. Puberty makes some adolescents feel attractive and self assured, but it makes others feel ugly and self conscious. Being able to think in hypothetical terms, that cognitive piece, right, makes some teenagers thankful that they grew up with their parents that they have, but it prompts others to run away from home. Reaching 18 prompts some teenagers to enlist in the military or apply for a marriage license, but for others, becoming an adult is frightening and unsettling. Um, so, that being said, if the fundamental changes of adolescence are universal, so puberty, those biological transitions, hypothetical thinking, those cognitive transitions, rites of passage, those social transitions, why are the effects so varied? Why isn't everyone affected in the same ways by puberty, by advanced thinking abilities, and by changes in their legal status? The answer is that psychological impact of the biological, cognitive, and social changes of adolescence is shaped by the environment in which the changes take place. In other words, psychological development during adolescence is a product of the interplay between a set of three very basic universal changes, and those three being biological, cognitive, and social, um, in the context in which those changes are experienced. So let's give an example. If we have two teenage girls, age 14, we'll call one Ashley, we'll call one Kayla. Let's start with Ashley. They don't grow up in the same neighborhood, Ashley and Kayla. They're in neighboring communities. So not the same neighborhood, but nearby, right? When Ashley went through puberty around age 13, her parents' first reaction was to restrict her social life. They were afraid she would become too involved with boys and neglect her schoolwork. Ashley thought her parents were being ridiculous. She rarely had a chance to meet anyone she wanted to date because all the older boys went to the high school across town. Even though she was in 8th grade, she was still going to school with 5th graders. Ashley reacted by pulling away from her parents because she felt that they were being overprotective. Kayla, on the other hand, also 14, her adolescence was very different. When she had her first period, her parents did not panic about her developing sexuality. Instead, they took her aside, discussed sex and pregnancy with her. They explained how different contraceptives worked and made an appointment for Kayla to see a gynecologist in case she ever needed to discuss something with a doctor. This made perfect sense. Although she was still only 14, Kayla would probably begin dating soon because in her community, the junior and senior high schools had been combined into one large school, and the older boys frequently showed interest in the younger girls. Puberty brought Kayla closer to her parents, not more distant. So they're two teenage girls, each went through puberty, each grew intellectually, and each moved closer in age to adulthood, towards that rite of passage, but yet each grew up in very different circumstances, in different families, different schools, different peer groups, different communities. Both are adolescents, but their adolescent experiences are markedly different. And as a result, each girl's psychological development will follow a different course. Imagine how different your adolescence would have been if you had grown up a century ago, and instead of going to high school, had been expected to work full-time from the age of 15. And that's true even today. I encounter many teenagers who have dropped out of school because they're trying to make ends meet for their families. Imagine how different it might be to grow up 100 years from today. Imagine how different adolescence is for a teenager from a very poor family than from one whose family is wealthy. Is it possible to generalize about the nature of adolescence without taking into account the surroundings and the circumstances in which the young person grew up? For this reason, an important part of our framework is the context of adolescence, and according to the ecological perspective on human development, whose main proponent was Uri Brafenbrenner, 1979, we cannot understand development without examining the environment in which it occurs. In modern societies, there are 4 main contexts in which young people spend time: their families, peer groups, schools, and work and leisure settings. Of course, these settings themselves are located within neighborhoods, which influence how they are structured and what takes place in them. It would be naive, for example, to discuss that school has an adolescent development with It would be naive, for example, to discuss the impact that school has on adolescent development without recognizing that a school in an affluent suburb is likely very different from one in the inner city or in a remote rural area. And the community in which these settings are located is itself embedded in a broader context that is shaped by culture, geography, and history. So those are Brafenbrenner's ideas. And you can see in this figure 1 on your screen, it kind of maps out Brafenbrenner's system. And if you go on Google Images and type in Brafenbrenner ecological system, you will see all kinds of graphic organizers that are similar to this, but that might help you wrap your head around it a little bit better. But the individual is there in the middle, and there's things that are immediately impacting that individual, right? So their immediate family impacts them, the neighborhood that they're in impacts them. But then even further out, they're still being influenced by their friends and neighbors, the community health services that are there, their extended family, the schools, the churches, all of these things impact that individual, and at a greater context, a greater level, further out, but still very influential on who this person becomes, are the laws, the values, the country that they live in, and that's all out in what Bronfenbrenner calls the macro system. Okay, but these are all influencing us. So, for example, if there's an economic problem in the United States, the economy is going to affect that individual, because what then does that person's school look like because of the economy? What does the pressures in the family look like because of the economy? Do the people in that family have to work 4 jobs to make ends meet? Does the family lose their home, and that affects the individual? In fact, I had a youth that I work with who kind of said that the reason he did the thing that he did, the criminal act that he did, was because he needed to take care of his family. It was very important to him. They had lost their home, and he just felt such a great urgency to take matters into his own hands. And there's a lot of values of the family that are embedded in that decision making. There's a lot of values of the law impacted his decision making. The values of our country, the values of his culture, the values of his neighborhood, all of these things kind of contributed to his decision making. Okay. Although young people growing up in modern America share some experiences with young people all over the world, their development is different in many ways from that of young people in other societies, especially those in less affluent and less industrialized ones, because their families, peer groups, schools, work, and leisure settings and neighborhoods are different. In other words, the contexts of adolescence are themselves shaped and defined by the larger society in which young people live. Okay, so what are some of those contexts? We're going to talk about those in a little bit more detail, not too much more detail. During the rest of this course, we're going to look at these areas in much more depth. But let's just start briefly with families. Adolescence is a time of dramatic change in family relationships. In addition, many changes in what constitute a family have taken place over the past several decades, leading to tremendous diversity in family forms and household composition in modern society. So is your family, does that include your extended family living in the same household? Does that mean that your parents got divorced and then there's a step siblings that live with you? Does it mean that you're raised by a single parent? So families have changed, evolved, changed structure over time, and given different, even the economy affects on who's living under that household. Culture as to the values of we always stick together as a family is going to shape who's living in that household. It's important to understand how changes within the family affect young people's psychological development. Okay, so then we've got peer groups. Over the last 100 years, the peer group has come to play an increasingly important role in the socialization and development of teenagers. It used to be 100 years ago, if you looked, peers weren't as much of a piece of the puzzle as they are today, right? So, but has the rise of peer groups in contemporary society been a positive or negative influence on the young people's development? This is one of the many questions that has interested researchers who study the nature and function of adolescent peer groups and their effects on teenagers' psychological development. Contemporary society with schools depends on schools. You know, we in contemporary society are dependent on schools to occupy, socialize, and educate our adolescents. how good a job are the schools doing, right? What should schools do to help prepare adolescents for adulthood? Are we doing that in our high schools? Are we really, really keeping that long term goal in mind when we're developing our day to day lessons in our classroom? Is this applicable to being a team player later in an occupation? Are the things that we're teaching in school going to help youth become able be able to manage the stress of being an adult and the stress of working a 9 to 5 and then possibly working a second job and managing a family? Are we teaching those skills of how to regulate our emotions and take care of our self-care? Are we doing this in schools? Are we really preparing adolescents for adulthood? And then work, leisure, and the mass media. Some of the most important influences on adolescent development are found outside of the home and school. So there's part-time jobs, extracurricular activities, mass media, including the internet. So to what extent do these forces influence adolescent attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors? And these are good questions that we're going to answer later when we get to those areas of the course. Okay, the final component of our framework. So we looked at those fundamental changes of adolescence, that last slide from the first lecture. We just talked about the context and how those fundamental changes depend on the context. And now we're going to talk about this third area, which is the psychosocial development in adolescence. So within that psychosocial development in adolescence is identity, autonomy, intimacy, sexuality, and achievement. And I've put those definitions there for you on this slide. Social scientists use the word psychosocial to describe aspects of development that are both psychological and social in nature. Sexuality, for example, is a psychosocial issue because it involves both psychological change and changes in the individual's relationship. So psychological change meaning there's changes in the individual's emotions, motivations, behavior. So that's the psychological part. And then there's the relationship part, and that's the social part. Of course, it is not only during the adolescent years that concerns about identity, autonomy, intimacy, sexuality, and achievement arise, and psychological or social problems can and do occur during all periods of the life cycle. But these psychosocial issues are present throughout the lifespan from infancy through late adulthood. They represent basic developmental changes that we face as we grow and change. So these are all part of, who am I questions and stuff are throughout the lifespan. Discovering and understanding who we are as individuals is an identity. So identity questions kind of are always present in some way, shape, or form. Establishing a healthy sense of independence, that's autonomy. That could come up later in the lifespan if you were to be married and then get a divorce, right? So you're going to deal with questions of autonomy. Forming close and caring relationships with other people, intimacy. Expressing sexual feelings and enjoying physical contact with others, sexuality. And being successful and competent members of society is achievement. Although these concerns are not unique to adolescence, development in each of these areas takes a special turn during this stage. So we are going to talk about each of these in much more detail later in the course, but just realize that all of these have some big piece to it in adolescence, right? Understanding how and why such psychosocial developments take place during adolescence is a major interest of scientists who study this age period. We know that individuals form close relationships before adolescence, for example, but why is that romantic relationships first develop during adolescence? We know that toddlers struggle with learning how to be independent, but why during adolescence do individuals need to be more on their own and make more decisions apart from their parents than it seemed like ever before. We know that children fantasize about what they want to be when they grow up, but why don't these fantasies become serious concerns until adolescence? Okay, so let's briefly talk about identity. In adolescence, a variety of important changes in the realm of identity occur. The adolescent may wonder, who am I, and what kind of life will I have? Coming to terms with these questions may involve a period of experimentation, a time of trying on different personalities in an attempt to discover one's true self. The adolescent's quest for identity is not only a quest for a personal sense of self, but also for recognition from others that he or she is a special, unique individual. Some of the most important changes of adolescence takes place in the realms of identity, self-esteem, and self-conceptions. Just knowing that an adolescent is really trying to get recognition from others that they are special and unique. Just knowing that as a parent, as a teacher, it's very helpful in understanding how you're going to react to certain situations. Because if you see them coming from that, like that's their reasoning, that's their intent, you may approach those adolescents in a different way when you're, rather than reprimanding them, for example. You may understand, like, they're just trying to belong in some way. Let me try to help them feel connection and feel belonging. And if I do that, maybe that will help them feel that sense of uniqueness that they're looking for. Autonomy. Adolescents struggle to establish themselves as independent, self-governing individuals in their own eyes and in the eyes of others. It is a long and occasionally difficult process, not only for young people, but also for those around them, especially their parents. I didn't put this on the slide, but under autonomy, there's like 3 pieces to it that we should kind of take note of. The 3 aspects of autonomy of a special importance during adolescence are: number 1, becoming less emotionally dependent on parents. Less emotionally dependent on parents. Number 2 is learning to function independently. Learning to function independently. And 3, establishing a personal code of values and morals. So establishing a personal code of values and morals. And we'll talk about that more later on. Then comes intimacy. During adolescence, important changes take place in the individual's capacity to be intimate with others, especially with peers. During adolescence, friendships emerge that involve openness, honesty, loyalty, and exchange of confidences, rather than simply a sharing of activities and interests. So there's more of this like closer connection and this sharing of something on a much more intimate level with our friends. Dating takes on increased importance, and as a consequence, so does the capacity to form romantic relationships that are trusting and loving. Then sexuality. Sexual activity usually begins during the adolescent years. Becoming sexual is an important aspect of development during adolescence, not only because it transforms the nature of relationships between adolescents and their peers, but also because it raises a range of difficult questions for the young person. These concerns include efforts to incorporate sexuality into a still developing sense of self, the need to resolve questions about their sexual values and morals. So, for example, they're having these sexual urges, and they have peers who may be sexually active, but they might have personal values within their family that are conflicting with that. They're not sure, am I ready to do that? Do I want to wait? And they're experiencing a lot of turmoil around these questions about their sexual values and morals, and coming to terms with sorts of relationship into which the types of relationships into which the adolescent is prepared or not prepared to enter. So there's sometimes an adolescent girl will come into my office when I worked at a high school as a therapist, and would have had made a decision at age 14 to have a sexual relationship, and then regretted it afterwards because it conflicted with who she believed she was, and she didn't know if she was ready. So these are all very serious matters that are on the forefront of a lot of adolescents, you know, pressures and stressors that they're dealing with. Okay, and then we've got achievement. Adolescence is a time of important changes in individuals' educational and vocational behavior and plans. They're making crucial decisions, many with long term consequences about schooling, careers. They're trying to figure out what they're going to do once they're done with high school, or if they're going to even complete high school. Many of these decisions depend on adolescents' achievement in school, on their evaluations of their own competencies and capabilities, on their aspirations and expectations for the future, and on the direction and advice they receive from parents, teachers, and friends. So if you have a belief system in your mind that, I'm not going to live much longer because people in my neighborhood are getting killed by gun violence, and if you have a learning disability that is particularly challenging for you and you're not getting your needs met because it doesn't seem that the school is providing everything that they need, or if the family is having some economic problems and they're not able to make ends meet, and you feel a lot of responsibility from your culture to help your family, you may drop out of high school. You may feel like school is not for you. But if you've been constantly told that you're really good at school and you have a real core belief that, you're going to be anything that you put your heart to, you can do it, then you're going to aim higher, and you're going to be planning these after high school, colleges. You're going to be applying to these, and you're going to be thinking in this way. So all of these factors are going to contribute to your achievement, how you view yourself, what your values are, what your neighborhood is like, what the expectations are from your family, and so on. So all of these are going to shape your achievement. What type of resources are put into your schools, right? All of those things. Okay. And we'll talk more about that later on as well. And our last slide is psychosocial problems. Most adolescents move through this period without experiencing major psychological upheaval. Okay, so most people, although there might be some challenges with their parents here and there, about what time they can come home, they might get in little arguments here or there. Most adolescents are moving through this period without experiencing major psychological upheaval. This stage of life is the most, given that, even though most are not going through anything major psychological, this is the period, though, where you will notice if there are some serious psychological difficulties. Okay, so they make their first real big appearance here. Okay, so the three sets of problems that are most often associated with adolescence are drug and alcohol use and abuse, delinquency and other externalizing behaviors or problems, and depression or other internalizing problems. In each case, we examine the prevalence of the problem, the factors we believe to contribute to its development, and then the approaches to prevention and intervention. By externalizing problems, those are things like I can't handle my anger very well, so I'm going to take it out on someone else by punching a wall or punching them, right? So these are externalizing problems. There's a whole list of them that you can probably find on the internet if you're curious, and we're going to talk about them some point later on. And then depression are internalizing problems. These are problems of, rather than taking it outside of the body and like hitting the wall, I'm going to instead kind of beat myself up by saying, I'm not worthy, nobody likes me. A lot of these cognitive internalizing problems that have to deal with like self-esteem and things like that. Okay. So that's the end of this lecture, and there'll be more on your way at another point. So I hope you are having a good time with the course, and I will talk to you soon.